Coffee rings stained the oak table, overlapping like Olympic rings of exhaustion. Faye stared at them while Declan packed. He didn't yell. He folded his sweaters, the ones she bought on clearance, with surgical precision. He said he needed space, but his phone buzzed with a text from someone named Sienna. People think heartbreak is a shattering thing. It isn't. It's the quiet zip of a suitcase, leaving you with half a month's rent and cold tea. Dust motes danced in the pale shaft of morning light, cutting through the living room blinds. Faye sat on the edge of the second-hand sofa, the rough, synthetic fabric scratching the bare skin at the back of her knees. She didn't move. She barely breathed. Her attention was anchored entirely to the sound coming from the bedroom. Zip. It was a smooth, expensive sound. The heavy brass zipper of the leather weekender bag Declan had purchased 3 months ago. He had justified the expense, claiming he needed to project success to attract investors for his boutique marketing firm. Faye had nodded, eaten instant ramen for 3 weeks to cover the electric bill, and believed him. Declan emerged from the bedroom. He looked flawless. He always did, even now, dismantling 10 years of shared history. His jaw was perfectly stubbled, his posture aggressively confident. He smelled of sandalwood, bergamot, and a faint, metallic tang of nervous sweat. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Instead, his gaze darted around the cramped apartment, lingering on the water stain near the ceiling, the chipped paint on the baseboards, anywhere but the woman he was leaving. "I've arranged for the rest of my things to be picked up on Tuesday," he said. His voice was entirely conversational, as if he were discussing a grocery list rather than the eviction of his presence from her life. Faye swallowed. Her throat felt like it was coated in ash. "Tuesday," she repeated. The word sounded foreign in her mouth. "Look, Faye." He finally glanced at her, though his eyes focused somewhere around her collarbone. "We've been drifting. You know we have. I'm entering a new phase of my life. My career is scaling, my network is changing, and we just aren't aligned anymore. I need someone who operates at my frequency." She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw the heavy ceramic mug resting on the coffee table straight at his perfectly symmetrical face. She wanted to tear at her own hair and demand to know what frequency he meant. Was it the frequency of paying his credit card minimums for 5 years? Was it the frequency of proofreading his pitch decks until 3 a.m. while she had a shift at the logistics warehouse at 6? But her body betrayed her rage with a profound leaden exhaustion. Her shoulders slumped. She picked at a loose thread on her worn sweatpants. "Sienna operates at your frequency then?" Declan stiffened. The brief flash of guilt on his face was quickly buried under a practiced mask of mild irritation. "This isn't about Sienna. Sienna is a colleague, a muse, frankly. She understands the aesthetic I'm building. A muse." Faye let out a short, breathy sound that was too dry to be a laugh. "She's a 22-year-old swimwear model, Declan. I saw the tagged photos. You aren't building an aesthetic. You're having a midlife crisis at 32. "I am not doing this with you," he snapped, his composure slipping just a fraction. He hoisted the leather bag over his shoulder. The leather groaned softly. "I'll deposit my half of this month's rent by Friday. You can keep the security deposit." He turned toward the door. The hardwood floor creaked under his polished Oxford shoes. Faye watched the broad span of his back, waiting for the cinematic moment. The moment he would pause, rest his hand on the doorknob, and look back with a tear in his eye, realizing the magnitude of his mistake. He didn't. The brass deadbolt clicked. The hinges squeaked. The door shut with a dull, hollow thud that rattled the cheap framed print hanging in the hallway. Faye sat in the ensuing silence. The radiator hissed in the corner, a rhythmic, metallic ticking that sounded like a bomb failing to detonate. The smell of his cologne lingered in the stagnant air, thick and suffocating. She stood up, her knees popping. She walked to the window and looked down at the street. Declan was climbing into the passenger seat of a sleek, black SUV. The driver's side window rolled down, and a cascade of blonde hair spilled out. Sienna. Declan leaned over the console, kissed her cheek, and the car pulled away, merging seamlessly into the mid-morning traffic. Faye didn't cry. Instead, she walked into the kitchen, opened the cabinet under the sink, and pulled out a bottle of bleach. She spent the next 4 hours scrubbing the bathroom grout until her knuckles bled, her eyes burning from the chemical fumes, desperately trying to erase the scent of sandalwood from her home. The first week without him was a study in phantom limbs. Faye would wake up at 5:30 a.m., automatically reaching for the left side of the mattress to pull the duvet back over Declan's chronically cold shoulders, only to grasp empty, cool sheets. She would make 2 cups of coffee before pouring one down the drain, watching the dark liquid swirl into the disposal, a daily sacrifice to a dead marriage. Her job at the regional logistics depot offered no refuge. The warehouse was a cavern of sensory assault. The relentless beep of reversing forklifts, the sharp smell of hot rubber and corrugated cardboard, the fluorescent lights humming overhead at a frequency that drilled directly into her temples. Faye sat in her gray cubicle, routing shipments of bulk paper towels and industrial solvents, a ghost pushing numbers across a glowing monitor. Her co-workers offered awkward, pitying smiles. They had noticed the missing wedding band. The pale indent on her ring finger felt like a scar, a bright, naked strip of skin that broadcasted her failure to anyone who looked closely. By the second week, the numbness began to rot into something sharper. Cynicism. It started on a Tuesday evening. Faye was sitting cross-legged on the floor, eating cold cereal directly out of a plastic mixing bowl. The television was on, muted, throwing blue light against the peeling wallpaper. Her phone sat on the floor beside her. She had promised herself she wouldn't look. She had made it 14 days. But the silence in the apartment was deafening, and masochism has a gravity of its own. She picked up the phone. She typed Sienna's name into the search bar. The grid of photos loaded instantly, a vibrant, highly saturated assault on Faye's senses. There was Sienna in Cabo, posing on the bow of a yacht, skin gleaming with expensive oil. Sienna in a Parisian cafe, biting into a croissant with perfectly manicured fingers. And then, the most recent post. Building empires with my favorite visionary. The photo was taken at a rooftop bar in Manhattan. Sienna was looking into the camera with a heavy-lidded, effortless pout. Beside her, half-cropped but unmistakable, was Declan. He was wearing a bespoke suit Faye had never seen. He looked relaxed, wealthy, completely untethered from the man who used to count pennies for subway fare. Faye stared at the screen until her vision blurred. She didn't feel heartbroken. She felt humiliated. She felt profoundly, deeply stupid. 10 years of sacrifice, of mending his socks, of swallowing her own ambitions so he could pursue his, and this was the payoff. He had siphoned her youth and her energy to build his foundation, and the moment he could afford a penthouse, he had changed the locks. She dropped the phone. The plastic back smacked against the hardwood. The next morning, the grayness of her life felt heavier, a physical weight pressing against her chest. She dragged herself out of bed, her hair limp and greasy, the taste of stale milk sour on her tongue. She walked downstairs to check the mail, a robotic routine. Junk mail, a final notice for Declan's dental bill, and a heavy, cream-colored envelope. Faye stopped. She stood in the dim, urine-scented vestibule of her apartment building, staring at the envelope in her hand. It was thick. The paper had a woven texture, heavy and authoritative. There was no return address printed on it, only a stark, embossed crest in the top left corner, a stylized griffin rendered in heavy black ink. Her name, Faye Eleanor Caldwell, was typed in a crisp serif font, not her married name, her maiden name, a name she hadn't used in 10 years. She turned it over. The flap was sealed with thick crimson wax, stamped with the same griffin. It felt out of place in her hands, a relic from a different century sitting under the flickering fluorescent bulb of a Brooklyn walk-up. A faint scent emanated from the paper. Not perfume, but the distinct dry smell of old money, leather, aged paper, and a hint of polished mahogany. Faye slid a blunt fingernail under the wax seal. It cracked with a sharp, satisfying snap. She pulled out a single sheet of heavy cardstock. The text was brief, typed with immaculate precision. Ms. Caldwell, you are urgently requested to attend a private reading regarding the estate of the late Harrison Vance Caldwell. Your presence is non-negotiable. Please arrive at the offices of Abernathy, Sterling & Cross at 10:00 a.m. on Thursday. Faye read the words 3 times. The letters seemed to float above the page. Harrison Caldwell. The name was a ghost story, a bitter myth her mother used to spit out after 3 glasses of cheap wine. The grandfather she had never met. The man who had disowned her mother for marrying a mechanic. The man her mother claimed owned half the Atlantic seaboard, though Faye had always assumed it was the exaggerated bitterness of a woman broken by poverty. He was dead, and according to this piece of paper, he had an estate. Faye looked up from the letter. Outside the smudged glass of the building's front door, a garbage truck groaned, hoisting a dumpster into the air with a screech of rusted hydraulics. The smell of rotting fruit and exhaust fumes wafted through the cracks in the door frame. She looked back down at the embossed crest. A low, strange sound bubbled up in her throat. A laugh, sharp and entirely devoid of humor, echoing off the dirty tiles of the lobby. The law firm of Abernathy, Sterling & Cross occupied the top 3 floors of a towering Glass Needle in the financial district. Faye had called in sick to the warehouse, a lie she delivered with a raspy voice that wasn't entirely feigned. Her stomach had been churning acid since she opened the letter. She stood in the express elevator, watching the digital floor numbers blur as she was launched upward. Her ears popped painfully. She looked at her reflection in the polished brass doors. She had tried to look presentable, wearing her only tailored blazer, a thrift store find that was slightly too broad in the shoulders, and a sensible black skirt. Beside the reflection of the sleek, wood-paneled elevator interior, she looked exactly like what she was, an intruder from a lower tax bracket. The doors chimed and slid open, depositing her onto the 42nd floor. The silence here was absolute, insulated by inches of soundproof glass and thick, charcoal gray carpeting that felt like moss under her worn flats. The air smelled of lemon oil, ozone, and cold, filtered money. "Ms. Caldwell?" Faye turned. A receptionist with razor-sharp cheekbones and a dress that cost more than Faye's annual rent was looking at her. The woman's gaze flicked over Faye's scuffed shoes for a microsecond before returning to a neutral, professional smile. "Yes, I'm here to see Mr. Abernathy. He is expecting you. Please follow me." Faye was led down a wide corridor lined with abstract, imposing art. They arrived at a set of heavy double doors. The receptionist opened one and gestured for Faye to enter. The corner office was vast, wrapped in floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying bird's-eye view of the city. The sky outside was a hard, brilliant blue. Behind a desk carved from a single slab of dark walnut sat an elderly man. He had a shock of white hair and wore a bespoke charcoal suit that draped flawlessly over his thin frame. He stood as she entered. "Faye, come in, sit down. I am Julian Abernathy." Faye walked to the leather chair opposite his desk and sat. The leather was soft, buttery, and sighed beneath her weight. She gripped the armrests. Her palms were sweating. "I don't understand why I'm here," Faye said, her voice sounding thin and reedy in the cavernous space. She cleared her throat. "My mother hadn't spoken to Harrison Caldwell in 30 years. I've never met him." Abernathy settled back into his chair, steepling his manicured, liver-spotted fingers. "Biology, Ms. Caldwell, often overrides sentimentality in matters of legacy. Your grandfather passed away 2 weeks ago. It was sudden, a massive stroke." "I'm sorry to hear that," Faye said, though she felt absolutely nothing. It was like hearing about the death of a historical figure. "Don't be. He was a deeply difficult man," Abernathy said, his candor surprising her. "He was ruthless, paranoid, and wholly obsessed with the Caldwell Corporation, which brings us to why you are sitting in that chair." Abernathy opened a thick leather binder on his desk. The crisp sound of turning pages cut through the quiet. "Harrison's only son, your Uncle Richard, died childless 5 years ago. Your mother passed last year. That leaves you, Faye, as the sole surviving direct descendant of the Caldwell bloodline." Faye's heart began to beat against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Okay, so what does that mean? Did he leave me a trust fund? A house?" Abernathy stopped turning pages. He looked up, his pale blue eyes pinning her to her seat. "A trust fund? No." He slid a heavy cream-colored document across the desk. "He left you the board seat. He left you the controlling shares. He left you the Caldwell Corporation, its subsidiaries, its real estate holdings across 3 continents, and its liquid assets." Faye stared at the document. It was a summary sheet. Her eyes snagged on a number at the bottom of the page. It wasn't a number. It was a barcode of digits. Commas broke it up into incomprehensible chunks. Net estimated valuation: $14,200,000. Faye felt the blood drain from her face so fast her vision darkened at the edges. The room tilted. The faint hum of the air conditioning suddenly sounded like a roaring jet engine. She clamped a hand over her mouth, genuinely afraid she was going to vomit all over the walnut desk. "Breathe, Ms. Caldwell," Abernathy instructed calmly, sliding a crystal tumbler of water toward her. Faye grabbed the glass, her hand shaking so violently the ice clinked against the sides. She took a sip. It was freezing and tasted faintly of cucumber. It grounded her slightly. 14. She couldn't say the word. It felt obscene. "This is a joke. This is a mistake. I manage forklift schedules. I have a negative balance in my checking account." "It is not a mistake," Abernathy said softly. "Harrison knew exactly what he was doing. He had private investigators tracking you for the last decade. He knew about your job. He knew about your mother's passing. He knew about your recent marital separation." Faye froze, the glass halfway to her mouth. The sheer violation of it hit her like a physical blow. "He spied on me?" "He observed his investment," Abernathy corrected without a hint of apology. "He wanted to see if you had grit. He watched you support a man who was actively draining your resources. He watched you work grueling hours without complaint. He believed you possessed the endurance the Caldwell empire requires, endurance his son never had." Faye set the glass down. The ice cracked. The realization of the timing hit her. Declan had left her 2 weeks ago. He had walked out, complaining about her lack of frequency, completely unaware that he was walking away from a woman who was, at that exact moment, inheriting a fortune that could buy his entire life, tear it down, and pave over it. A laugh bubbled up in her chest again, darker and more jagged than the one in the lobby. She bit the inside of her cheek to stifle it, tasting copper. "There has to be a catch," Faye said, leaning forward, her knuckles white. "People don't just hand over $14 billion to a stranger without strings." Abernathy offered a thin, approving smile. "You are astutely paranoid, a good trait for a CEO. Yes, there are conditions. The Caldwell empire is currently under threat. A hostile takeover is being engineered by a rival conglomerate, Apex Holdings. The board is fractured. They smell blood in the water. They will look at you, a warehouse worker with no corporate pedigree, and they will try to eat you alive." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, heavy, rectangular object. He placed it on the documents. It was a matte black titanium card. "This is an unlimited corporate expense account, linked to a private discretionary fund. It is active immediately." Abernathy closed the binder. "You have 30 days until the annual shareholder meeting. 30 days to assume command, unify the board, and prove you are a Caldwell. If you fail, the board will initiate a vote of no confidence, force a buyout, and the legacy will be dismantled." Faye stared at the black card. It absorbed the light from the window. It looked heavy. It looked like a weapon. "And if I refuse?" she asked quietly. "If I walk out that door right now, then the estate is liquidated. A sizable portion goes to charity, and you receive a modest stipend of $100,000 a year for life. Comfortable. Safe." Abernathy leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "But I watched the footage of your husband leaving you for a swimsuit model, Faye. Are you really interested in safe?" The mention of Declan was deliberate. It was a calculated strike, and it landed perfectly. Faye felt a strange, cold sensation wash over her. The exhaustion that had weighed her down for 10 years suddenly evaporated, replaced by a hyper-focused, freezing clarity. She looked out the window at the sprawling city below. She thought about the smell of cheap bleach. She thought about Declan's smug, flawless jawline. She thought about the word frequency. She reached across the desk. Her fingers closed around the cold black metal of the card. "Mr. Abernathy," Faye said, her voice dropping an octave, entirely devoid of the tremor it held 5 minutes ago. "Where do we start? Money does not feel like freedom. It feels like a temperature drop." Faye sat in the back of a chauffeured Maybach, the upholstery smelling aggressively of untouched leather and peppermint. Her reflection in the tinted window was a stranger. A team of stylists, contracted by Abernathy, had spent 3 days stripping her of her past. They had bleached the brassiness from her hair, toning it to a cold, icy ash. They had thrown out her polyester blends and encased her in a tailored charcoal suit made of worsted wool that felt like soft armor. The fabric didn't breathe. It commanded. The Caldwell Corporation headquarters loomed ahead, a monolithic spire of black glass slicing into the Manhattan skyline. Faye's stomach twisted, a familiar, greasy knot of anxiety. She pressed her thumb against the heavy platinum watch encircling her left wrist. It cost more than the sum total of every paycheck she had ever earned, yet the metal was perpetually, uncomfortably cold against her skin. The underground parking garage was silent, bathed in sterile LED light. An executive elevator shot her directly to the 65th floor. When the doors parted, she stepped into the nerve center of the empire. It was a hive of muted panic. Dozens of people in dark suits moved across the expanse of polished marble, their voices reduced to a collective, anxious hum. At the center of the reception area stood a woman with a severe auburn bob, holding a biometric tablet. "Ms. Caldwell, I am Beatrice, Chief of Staff." The woman's eyes flicked up and down Faye's silhouette, performing a micro-calculation of her worth. "The board is waiting in conference room A. They are currently drafting a public statement regarding your grandfather's passing. Arthur Penhaligon has motioned to include a clause outlining an interim leadership transition." Faye felt a prickle of sweat at her hairline. "He wants to name himself acting CEO, effectively." "Yes." Beatrice turned on her heel, her Louboutins clicking sharply against the stone. "You have 4 minutes to stop him." Faye followed. Her legs felt hollow, like dry reeds. She had spent the last 72 hours sequestered in a hotel suite, force-feeding herself financial dossiers, subsidiary reports, and shipping manifests. The numbers had blurred, turning into meaningless static. She was a warehouse dispatcher. She didn't belong here. She wanted to turn around, take the elevator down, and go buy a stale bagel from the corner bodega. But then she remembered Declan folding his sweaters. She remembered the sound of the zipper. Beatrice pushed open the heavy oak doors of the conference room. 12 faces turned toward Faye. 12 older, predominantly male faces, etched with varying degrees of shock, disdain, and predatory curiosity. The air in the room smelled sharply of roasted espresso and ozone. At the head of the long mahogany table stood Arthur Penhaligon. He had the ruddy complexion of a man who drank scotch for lunch, and a smile that didn't reach his flat, gray eyes. "Ah, the prodigal granddaughter," Arthur said, his voice a smooth baritone that echoed in the vast room. He didn't offer his hand. "We were just finalizing the press release. I'm sure this is incredibly overwhelming for you, Faye. We've set up a transition team to handle the heavy lifting while you acclimatize. Faye stood at the opposite end of the table. The silence stretched. Her throat was bone dry. She looked down at the tablet Beatrice had placed in front of her. A map of Caldwell Corporation's global supply chain stared back at her. Shipping routes, warehouses, freight lines. Suddenly the static cleared. It wasn't abstract finance. It was logistics. It was just boxes. Millions of boxes moving across oceans instead of across a warehouse floor in Brooklyn, but the physics of inefficiency were exactly the same. She looked up at Arthur. The tremor in her hands stopped. "There will be no transition team, Arthur," Faye said. Her voice was quiet, forcing the men in the room to lean forward to hear her. "And you aren't releasing that statement." Arthur's patronizing smile thinned. "Faye, be reasonable. Apex Holdings is preparing a hostile bid. Our stock is down 4% since the bell. We need a steady, experienced hand at the wheel, not someone whose resume ends at regional freight management." "My resume," Faye interrupted, stepping up to the edge of the table, "means I know exactly why our European shipping subsidiary is bleeding $30 million a quarter. You've been using third-party freight forwarders out of Rotterdam instead of utilizing our own dormant cargo fleet docked in Antwerp. You've prioritized short-term tax write-offs over supply chain sovereignty." The room went deathly still. A man near the window stopped clicking his pen. Faye walked slowly down the length of the table. "You think Apex smells blood because Harrison died? No. They smell blood because our fulfillment network is bloated. We are paying storage premiums on empty square footage in Berlin while double booking cargo space in Shenzhen. It's sloppy. It's amateur." She stopped directly behind Arthur's chair. She could smell his cologne, heavy, spiced, entirely too strong. "If you try to sideline me, Arthur, I will initiate an independent audit into the Rotterdam contracts. I wonder who authorized those third-party vendors." Arthur's ruddy face drained of color. He slowly sank into his chair. Faye walked to the head of the table. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt a cold, hollow ache in her chest. She placed her hands flat on the mahogany surface. "Draft a new press release," Faye ordered, looking at the pale faces around her. "Faye Caldwell has assumed full executive control. Meeting adjourned." The annual Vanguard Gala was held in the vaulted atrium of the Natural History Museum. Beneath the shadow of a suspended blue whale, New York's elite gathered to drink $100 champagne and bid on art they didn't understand. Faye stood near the vertebrate exhibit, nursing a glass of sparkling water. The gown Abernathy's team had selected was an architectural marvel of emerald silk. It clung to her ribs like a second skin, heavy and unforgiving. The corset dug into her lower back, a constant pinching reminder of her new reality. She hated this. The noise was a grating cacophony of fake laughter and clinking crystal. She missed the deafening roar of the forklifts. At least the warehouse was honest in its brutality. Here, the violence was tucked behind veneered smiles and charitable donations. "Ms. Caldwell, the senator from New York is asking for an introduction." Beatrice appeared at her elbow, a phantom in black crepe. Faye closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. "Tell him I'm viewing the fossils. Give me 5 minutes." Beatrice nodded and dissolved back into the crowd. Faye turned toward the glass display cases, seeking a moment of absolute quiet. She stared at the bleached ribs of a prehistoric predator, finding a strange comfort in the dead, silent bones. I just think the pitch needs to focus more on the paradigm shift, Sienna. These investors are looking for disruption, not just ROI. The voice cut through the ambient noise like a serrated knife. Faye froze. The sparkling water in her glass trembled, sending a miniature tidal wave over the rim to splash freezing cold against her thumb. She knew that voice. She had listened to it complain about the price of eggs. She had listened to it whisper in the dark. She had listened to it dismantle her life. She turned her head slowly. Less than 10 feet away stood Declan. He was wearing a velvet dinner jacket that looked expensive, but fit poorly around the shoulders. He was sweating, a thin sheen of grease across his forehead, his jaw clenched tight with the frantic, desperate energy of a man trying to punch above his weight class. Beside him, clinging to his arm, was Sienna. The model was poured into a gold-sequined dress, looking profoundly bored as she scrolled on her phone. Declan was flagging down a waiter. As he turned, his eyes swept past the dinosaur exhibit. They locked onto Faye. The waiter walked right past him. Declan didn't notice. His mouth opened slightly. The color drained from his face, leaving his perfect stubble looking stark and unnatural against his pale skin. He blinked, hard, as if trying to clear a hallucination. Faye didn't move. She didn't smirk. She just watched him process the data. He took in the emerald silk. He took in the 4-carat diamond resting at the hollow of her throat. He took in the posture, rigid, cold, entirely devoid of the exhaustion he had left her with. He took a tentative step forward, leaving Sienna behind. "Faye," he breathed. The word barely carried over the string quartet playing in the background. "Declan," she replied. Her voice was flat, neutral. He stopped a few feet away. He looked wildly out of place, like a boy wearing his father's suit. What are you doing here? Are you working the event?" He glanced at her empty glass, a desperate attempt to contextualize her presence into something he understood. Faye looked down at the glass, then back at him. "No, Declan, I'm not catering." "Then how did you get in? A ticket to this is $10,000. His brow furrowed in genuine confusion. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a frantic hiss. "Faye, if you snuck in here, you need to leave. Security is incredibly tight. I am trying to secure seed funding tonight. I cannot have my ex-wife causing a scene." "Mr. Caldwell?" A tall man with silver hair and a tuxedo interrupted, stepping smoothly between them. It was Richard Sterling, a senior partner from Abernathy's firm. He didn't look at Declan. He only looked at Faye. "Apologies for the interruption, Ms. Caldwell. The museum director is ready to present the plaque for the Caldwell Foundation's endowment." Declan stopped breathing. He looked from Sterling to Faye and back again. The gears in his head ground together, screaming as they caught on the math. Ms. Caldwell, Caldwell Foundation. "Endowment?" Declan choked out, his voice cracking. Faye finally allowed herself a small, infinitesimal shift in expression. It wasn't a smile. It was the absolute, crushing weight of pity. It was worse than anger. "Excuse me, Declan," she said smoothly, handing her empty glass to a passing waiter. "I have to go by a wing of the museum. Good luck with your paradigm shift." She turned and walked away. The emerald silk swept across the polished marble floor with a sound like rushing water. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could feel the heat of his devastation radiating against her spine, a pathetic, dying ember. As she walked toward the flash of the photographer's cameras, Faye realized something terrifying. The revenge didn't taste sweet. It tasted like nothing at all. The 30-day deadline was up. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Caldwell boardroom, blurring the Manhattan skyline into a smear of gray and bruised purple. The ambient light in the room was dim, reflecting off the polished mahogany table. Faye sat at the head. She wasn't wearing a blazer today. She wore a simple, severe black turtleneck. Her hair was pulled back tightly. She looked less like a corporate executive and more like a minimalist architect preparing to demolish a building. To her left sat Julian Abernathy, his hands folded neatly over his leather portfolio. To her right sat Beatrice, typing soundlessly on her tablet. Lining the table were the board members, and at the far end, looking like a vulture that had missed its meal, sat Arthur Penhaligon. "The apex bid is formal," Arthur announced, tossing a thick bound document onto the center of the table. It landed with a heavy, final thud. "They are offering an 18% premium on our current share price. The market wants this. The shareholders want this. If we fight it, they will initiate a proxy war, and we will bleed out." Murmurs of agreement rippled down the table. The older men shifted in their leather chairs, avoiding Faye's gaze. "It's a generous exit strategy, Faye," Arthur continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "You've done remarkably well holding the fort for a month. But this is a global war. Take the payout. You'll walk away a billionaire. Go buy an island. Let the adults handle the transition." Faye stared at the document. She didn't reach for it. She let the silence stretch until the sound of the rain hitting the glass became deafening. She felt a strange, detached calm. The panic that had defined her first week was gone, burned away by sleepless nights and the brutal realization that in this room, empathy was a liability. "Apex isn't buying us because they want our assets, Arthur," Faye said, her voice cutting through the ambient noise. "They are buying us to bury our supply chain infrastructure. They are heavily leveraged in Southeast Asia, and our new shipping routes threaten their monopoly." "Irrelevant," Arthur snapped. "The premium is 18%. Fiduciary duty dictates we present this to the shareholders. Fiduciary duty dictates we protect the long-term solvency of the Caldwell Empire," Faye countered, leaning forward. "Which is why, as of 6 a.m. this morning, I authorized a scorched earth protocol." Arthur froze. "You did what?" Faye tapped her tablet. The large screen at the end of the room flared to life. It displayed a barrage of financial filings, time-stamped just hours ago. "Apex Holdings is heavily reliant on lithium contracts out of South America to power their tech subsidiaries," Faye stated, her voice devoid of inflection. "They rely on 3 primary freight carriers to move that raw material. Over the last 2 weeks, I used our discretionary liquidity to buy out the controlling stakes in 2 of those freight companies." The color rapidly drained from Arthur's face. The other board members leaned in, squinting at the screens, the math clicking into place in their heads. "As of Monday," Faye continued, "Apex will find their shipping rates for raw lithium have increased by 400%. Their profit margins for the next 2 quarters will evaporate. Their stock will plummet." The hostile bid they just submitted is backed by leverage they can no longer afford. She looked directly down the table at Arthur. Her eyes were cold, flat, entirely unrecognizable from the woman who used to cry over unpaid electricity bills. Apex isn't buying us, Arthur. In 3 months, when they are facing bankruptcy, we are going to buy them, for parts. The boardroom erupted. Men stood up, voices overlapping in a chaotic mix of outrage, shock, and sudden, terrifying respect. Abernathy sat perfectly still, a thin, deeply satisfied smile playing on his lips. "You can't do this unilaterally!" Arthur shouted over the noise, slamming his fist on the table. "The board has to vote on acquisitions of that scale. The discretionary fund bypasses board approval in the event of an existential threat," Faye recited flawlessly, closing her tablet. "Grandfather wrote the loophole himself in 1998. I just used it." She stood up. The room instantly fell silent. The raw exertion of power was a physical pressure in the air. "The apex threat is neutralized," Faye said, smoothing the front of her turtleneck. "Now we have internal housekeeping. Arthur, your aggressive push for a buyout, coupled with your unauthorized communications with Apex executives, which Beatrice so efficiently pulled from the server logs, constitutes a breach of fiduciary trust." Arthur's jaw went slack. He looked at Beatrice, who simply raised an immaculate eyebrow. "I am demanding your immediate resignation," Faye said. "If you refuse, I will litigate you until your grandchildren are paying my legal fees. Leave your key card on the desk." She didn't wait for his response. She didn't wait for the applause or the validation of the men who had just realized they were swimming with a shark. She turned and walked out of the boardroom. The heavy oak doors sealed shut behind her, cutting off the noise. Faye stood alone in the hallway. The silence was absolute. She leaned against the cold glass of the window, looking out at the rain-slicked city below. Millions of tiny, insignificant lights burning in the gray gloom. She had won. She had secured the empire. She had $12 billion, terrifying power, and a corporate throne. She lifted her trembling hand and pressed it against the cold glass. Her reflection stared back at her. The icy blonde hair, the hollow shadowed eyes, the rigid posture. Harrison Caldwell's private investigators had been right. She had the grit. But as she stood at the pinnacle of the world, feeling the icy draft of the air conditioning against her skin, Faye realized the true cost of the inheritance. She hadn't just defeated Arthur Penhaligon. She had defeated the woman she used to be. The woman who loved deeply, who forgave easily, who believed in the warmth of a shared life. That woman was dead, buried under mountains of corporate filings and titanium credit cards. Faye closed her eyes, resting her forehead against the freezing glass, and for the first time since Declan packed his bags, she wept, not for the marriage, but for the piece of her soul she had just sold to keep the empire alive. Zip. The phantom sound echoed in the empty hallway, the final seal on her isolation. Winter arrived in New York with a brutal, biting indifference. From the 72nd floor of the Caldwell residential tower, Central Park looked like a massive, frozen, rectangular corpse laid out in the middle of the city. Faye stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, holding a ceramic mug. It wasn't the fine bone china her interior decorator had sourced from Kyoto. It was a chipped, heavy diner mug she had bought at a thrift store in Brooklyn 7 years ago. Inside was cheap, bitter instant coffee. It was a daily, masochistic ritual to keep her taste buds grounded in reality. 6 months had passed since the boardroom coup. 6 months of restructuring, of slashing bloated divisions and consolidating power. She had fired 52 executives. She had stabilized the stock. She had become exactly what Harrison Caldwell engineered her to be, a living, breathing ledger. Ms. Caldwell, Beatrice materialized in the doorway of the penthouse study. She never knocked. She simply announced her presence. It was an efficiency Faye had come to appreciate. "The Chicago Logistics Hub," Beatrice said, holding a slim tablet. "The regional directors are recommending a lockout. The floor workers are threatening to strike over the new shift quotas and a demand for a $2 hourly increase. The directors want to bring in scab labor by Tuesday to break them." Faye took a slow sip of the scalding, bitter coffee. She closed her eyes. Instantly, the sterile smell of ozone and lilies in her penthouse was replaced by the phantom stench of hot corrugated cardboard, diesel exhaust, and cheap break-room microwave burritos. She felt the dull, throbbing ache in her lower back from standing on unpadded concrete for 9 hours straight. "Override the directors," Faye said, opening her eyes. "Grant the $2 increase. Approve the request for anti-fatigue floor mats and mandate a mandatory 45-minute lunch break, fully clocked." Beatrice's pen hovered over the screen. "That will increase operational costs in the Midwest sector by $4.2 million annually. And the turnover rate in that facility is currently 38%, Faye countered, her voice dry and mechanical. "Training new hires costs us $12 million a year in lost efficiency and shipping errors, not to mention the insurance premiums on fatigue-related forklift accidents. The directors are stepping over $100 bills to pick up pennies because they want to feel powerful. Tell them if they suggest a lockout again, I will lock them out. Permanently. Understood." Beatrice tapped the screen. She didn't look up. "There is one more thing," security at the lobby desk called up. "There is a man asking to see you. He has been sitting in the atrium for 4 hours. He refuses to leave." Faye didn't need to ask for a name. The sudden, strange stillness in her chest gave her the answer. "Send him up," she said. 10 minutes later, the private elevator chimed. The heavy oak doors of the study parted. Declan walked in. He didn't look like the man who had packed his leather weekender bag 6 months ago. The aggressive, polished confidence was entirely gone, hollowed out by gravity and consequence. His charcoal coat was damp with melted snow, smelling sharply of wet wool and stale subway air. His boots squeaked softly against the imported hardwood floor. He looked thinner, his cheekbones sharp, his eyes shadowed with a desperate, frantic exhaustion. He stopped a few feet into the room, staring at the sheer scale of the study, the vaulted ceilings, the walls lined with first editions, the sprawling view of the frozen city. Finally, his eyes landed on Faye. She wore a simple, oversized cashmere sweater and tailored slacks. She didn't look angry. She didn't look triumphant. She simply looked at him the way one looks at a delayed subway train, an inconvenience that had long since lost its power to surprise. "Faye," he whispered. His voice was raw, scraped hollow by the winter air. "Declan." She didn't offer him a seat. She stayed by the window, the chipped mug warming her palms. 4 hours in the lobby is a long time. You're tracking slush on the oak." He looked down at his boots, a flush of deep, humiliating red creeping up his neck. I didn't know where else to go. I tried calling your old number, but it's disconnected. I tried reaching out to your lawyers, but they sent a cease and desist. A standard operational procedure for unsolicited contact. Why are you here? He swallowed hard. His hands were trembling, buried deep in his coat pockets. Sienna left 3 months ago. She cleared out the apartment in Cabo and left me with the lease on the Tribeca place. I couldn't make the rent. I am not a therapist, Declan, and I certainly am not a leasing agent. My firm went under, he blurted out, the words tumbling over each other in a rush of panic. The seed funding fell through. The investors I was courting, they were heavily leveraged with Apex Holdings. When Apex's stock tanked in October, they pulled all their capital. My business was entirely collateral damage. Faye looked down into the black abyss of her coffee. She knew exactly why Apex's stock had tanked. She had pulled the lever herself. She had crushed a massive corporate entity to secure her throne, and in the process, the shockwave had inadvertently vaporized Declan's fragile, borrowed life. It was a staggering display of cause and effect. Yet feeling the absolute totality of her victory, Faye felt no joy, just a heavy, metallic exhaustion. You built your house on sand, Faye said softly. You attached yourself to people who valued aesthetics over foundations. It was bound to collapse. Declan took a step forward, his boots leaving dark, wet half-moons on the wood. I know. God, Faye, I know. I was an idiot. I was blinded by the networking, by the illusion of it all. But standing here, losing everything, it made me realize what I threw away. We built a life together for 10 years. You were the only one who ever believed in me when I had nothing. Faye let out a breath. It wasn't a sigh. It was a slow, controlled release of pressure. Stop! She commanded. The single word hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Declan froze. Do not insult my intelligence by pretending this is about love, or regret, or realizing my worth, Faye said, her voice terrifyingly calm. She walked to her massive mahogany desk and set the cheap mug down. The clink of ceramic against wood echoed loudly in the quiet room. You didn't realize my worth, Declan. You realized my net worth. That's not true. I was your angel investor, Faye interrupted, her tone clinical, dissecting him with surgical precision. I invested 10 years of my youth, my physical health, and my credit score into you. I worked double shifts routing freight so you could buy bespoke suits to impress teenagers on yachts. I was the seed capital for your ego. And the second you thought you had a return on that investment, you liquidated me. Declan stared at her, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The damp wool of his coat seemed to hang heavier on his shoulders, physically dragging him down. You aren't here because you miss me, Faye continued, leaning against the edge of the desk, crossing her arms over the soft cashmere. You are here because you are drowning in debt. Your credit is ruined, and you are staring down the barrel of the life I used to live. You are terrified of taking the subway. You are terrified of cheap coffee. You are here for a bailout. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. The radiator in the penthouse didn't hiss like the one in their old apartment. It was a silent, invisible climate control system, making the air feel even more lifeless. Declan's shoulders finally caved. The pretense dissolved, leaving only a small, desperate man. 70,000, he whispered, his eyes dropping to the floor. Just $70,000 to clear the business debts and keep me out of bankruptcy court. It's nothing to you now, Faye. It's pocket change. Please, I'll sign whatever you want. Faye looked at him. She searched her chest for the girl who used to mend his sweaters, who used to leave love notes on the bathroom mirror, who used to cry at the thought of him being stressed. That girl was entirely, permanently gone. Harrison Caldwell had burned her on a pyre of corporate filings. $70,000, Faye repeated softly. She walked back over to the window, turning her back on him, looking out at the frozen expanse of the park. Do you remember the night you left, Declan? You told me you needed someone who operated at your frequency. Declan flinched as if he had been struck. Faye, please. You were right, she said, her breath fogging the cold glass for a fraction of a second. We operate on entirely different frequencies. You are a bad investment, Declan. You yield no dividends, you hold no intrinsic value, and you are entirely devoid of loyalty. She didn't turn around. She just stared at the ice below. I don't throw good money after bad. Security will escort you to the lobby. Declan stood paralyzed for a long moment. He waited for the anger, the screaming, the emotional explosion he could negotiate with. But he met only an impenetrable wall of absolute, freezing indifference. It was the worst punishment she could have possibly inflicted. He had become irrelevant. The sound of his wet boots slowly dragging across the floor was the only sound in the room. The heavy oak doors clicked open and then clicked shut. Faye stood alone in the vast, beautiful, empty penthouse. She picked up her chipped diner mug. The coffee had gone completely cold. She drank it anyway, letting the bitter taste coat her throat. A stark reminder that while she owned the skyline, the view was always coldest from the top. Have you ever watched someone walk away thinking they took your whole world, only to realize they just made room for your empire? Faye's journey from the brutal floors of a warehouse to the bloodless heights of the boardroom proves that sometimes the most devastating rejections are just the universe violently clearing your path. If this story of resilience, cold logic, and reclaiming power resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the human psyche. Share this with someone who needs to remember their true value. Drop a comment below. What would be your first move with $14 billion?